There is a strange moment in archaeology when something appears on a map that simply should not be there. Not a ship, not a building, not even a recognizable ruin. Just hundreds of enormous piles of stone sitting beneath the clear waters of Lake Constance along the Swiss shoreline. At first, they looked like a geological feature. But when researchers started looking closer, the pattern became difficult to explain. Around 170 separate mounds stretched across roughly 10 kilometers of lakebed. Some were more than a meter high, and together they contained an estimated 60 million individual stones, weighing around 78,000 tons. Then came the discovery that changed the story. These formations weren't created by a glacier. They weren't random piles of rocks. Evidence from underwater archaeology and geological testing suggested that people had deliberately built them thousands of years ago. And that meant something extraordinary had happened here long before the lake looked anything like it does today. The question was no longer, what are these? It became, why did people build them? And the answer takes us back more than 5,000 years. Lake Constance sits between Germany, Switzerland, and Austria. Today, it looks almost impossibly peaceful. Boats cross the surface. Towns line the shoreline. Tourists walk beside the water. From above, there is almost nothing to suggest that an enormous prehistoric landscape is hidden underneath. But the lake has been hiding human history for a very long time. The region is famous for prehistoric pile-dwelling settlements, communities associated with the Neolithic and Bronze Ages, whose remains were preserved in the waterlogged sediments around alpine lakes. Some sites contain wooden structures, tools, pottery, and other traces of daily life. The underwater environment can be remarkably protective. Oxygen-poor sediments can preserve materials that would normally disappear on land. That is why archaeologists have been able to reconstruct pieces of prehistoric life that are almost completely invisible from the modern shoreline. But the stone formations were different. They weren't simply another village. They formed a chain, and that was the first major clue. The story began with modern technology. Between 2013 and 2015, researchers carried out detailed bathymetric surveys of Lake Constance. Instead of simply looking down through the water, they mapped the lakebed in extraordinary detail. The resulting maps revealed something unexpected along the southern Swiss shore. A series of circular mounds appeared in shallow water. They were positioned roughly parallel to the shoreline, and they weren't scattered randomly. They extended for approximately 10 kilometers from the area of Altnau toward Romanshorn. Individual mounds could measure between 10 and 30 meters across. Some reached about 1.5 meters in height, and many were separated by remarkably regular distances, roughly 85 to 110 meters apart. That regularity was difficult to ignore. Nature can create strange patterns. Glaciers can move enormous amounts of material. Rivers can rearrange sediment. Storms can reshape shorelines. So the first question was simple. Could this entire structure have been natural? If it was, the story would be interesting. If it wasn't, the implications were enormous. Researchers began testing the formations from different angles. Geophysical surveys were especially important. One technique, ground-penetrating radar, allowed scientists to examine what was underneath the mounds rather than simply studying their surfaces. The results created a problem for the natural explanation. The formations were sitting on top of layers of lake sediments. They did not appear to be part of the underlying glacial geology. In other words, the stones weren't simply an ancient geological ridge that happened to look organized. The evidence pointed towards something much more unusual. Someone had placed them there. But who? And when? The answer came from something far less dramatic than the giant stone structures themselves. During archaeological investigations, researchers recovered fragments of wood associated with the mounds. Radiocarbon dating placed the construction horizon at roughly 5,600 to 5,300 calibrated years before present. That puts the main phase of construction in the Neolithic period. Thousands of years before the Roman Empire. Thousands of years before medieval Europe. Long before the first written records from this region. And suddenly, those piles of stones became something completely different. They were not simply underwater geology. They were evidence of a human project carried out more than 5 millennia ago. But this created an even bigger mystery. Why would Neolithic people move so much stone into a lake? Imagine the landscape at the time. The lake level was not necessarily where it is today. The shoreline was changing, the climate was changing, and the shelf along the edge of the lake was gradually evolving. Researchers found evidence suggesting that the mounds were constructed during a relatively low water phase. That matters, because the people who built them may not have been standing deep underwater. The lake was different. Parts of the shelf may have been exposed or much shallower than they are now. As conditions changed, rising water gradually covered the structures. What looks today like an underwater construction project may therefore have begun in a very different landscape, one where prehistoric communities could actually reach the places they were building. And this is where the story becomes more complicated, because archaeologists still don't have a simple answer for what the mounds were actually for. Several possibilities have been considered. They could have been connected with prehistoric settlement activity. They may have had some relationship to the shoreline. They could have served a practical purpose that is now difficult to recognize. But the evidence does not justify simply declaring that they were roads, walls, temples, or monuments. And that's important, because archaeology is often less about finding an object with a label attached, and more about reconstructing human behavior from fragments. The stones tell us that something deliberate happened. The dating tells us roughly when. The geological evidence tells us something about the environment. But the exact purpose remains much harder to determine. And that uncertainty is not a weakness in the discovery. It is part of what makes it fascinating. There was another clue. The entire chain contains an estimated 60 million stones. Researchers calculate that the total mass could be around 78,000 tons. That's difficult to comprehend, because we're not talking about one prehistoric family moving a few rocks around. We're talking about an enormous organized effort repeated across kilometers of shoreline. And yet, there is no giant inscription explaining what it was for. No ancient document. No written instructions. No name. No obvious monument standing above the water. Just stone. Stone placed by people who lived in a world without modern machinery, modern surveying equipment, or written engineering plans. Whatever they were trying to accomplish, they had to understand the landscape well enough to build something that survived for thousands of years. But there was still a problem. How certain can we really be that these formations were artificial? This is where the scientific evidence becomes important. Researchers didn't rely on appearance alone. They combined bathymetric mapping, ground-penetrating radar, sediment cores, geological analysis, and radiocarbon dating. The sediment cores reached through the lake deposits and down toward much older material. They revealed a sequence extending back roughly 14,400 years, allowing researchers to reconstruct how the lake environment developed after the last ice age. Then the dating of the horizon associated with the mounds pointed toward the Neolithic period. The different lines of evidence began telling the same story. The structures were not simply natural glacial remnants. They had been built on a changing lakeshore environment, and their construction appears to coincide with a period when water levels were relatively low. That doesn't answer every question, but it makes the central conclusion much stronger. Someone had moved those stones, and this changes how we should imagine prehistoric Europe. It's easy to picture Neolithic communities as small groups living simple lives, surrounded by forests and primitive tools. But the archaeology of alpine lake settlements tells a more complicated story. These communities understood materials. They built substantial structures. They worked with wood. They adapted to changing water levels. And they occupied landscapes that were constantly shifting. At Lake Constance, the environment itself became part of the archaeological record. When the water rose, it didn't necessarily destroy everything. In some cases, it preserved it. Wood disappeared from ordinary landscapes, but underwater, fragments could survive. Structures vanished beneath sediment. Yet centuries later, they could still be detected by modern instruments. The lake became an accidental archive. There is also an important lesson in what happened to the interpretation of these sites. For generations, archaeologists have debated exactly how prehistoric communities around alpine lakes interacted with the water. Were their settlements literally built over the lake? Were they mainly on the shoreline? Did changing water levels transform the relationship between land and water? Modern underwater archaeology has made those questions much more complicated and much more interesting. The submerged mounds fit into that broader picture. They show that prehistoric people were not passive observers of their environment. They were modifying it. And they may have done so on a scale far larger than anyone would expect from a landscape that looks completely natural today. Then comes the strangest part. Look at the lake now. From the surface, almost none of this is visible. A boat can pass directly above a prehistoric construction site without the passengers knowing anything is below them. A swimmer can look into the clear water and see only a few meters of the modern lake. Underneath that surface are sediments containing traces of landscapes that no longer exist. Settlements, wood, tools, stone structures, and an environment shaped by people more than 5,000 years ago. The modern lake hasn't erased that world. It has hidden it. And sometimes the only reason we know it exists is because a machine sends a signal through the water and reveals a pattern that human eyes cannot see. And that may be the most important part of this discovery. The stones themselves are impressive. 60 million of them. 10 kilometers of structures. Tens of thousands of tons of material. But the real discovery isn't the number. It's the realization that the landscape beneath Lake Constance is not simply an empty lakebed. It is a record of human decisions. People stood here thousands of years ago. They looked at the same water. They lived beside the same mountains. They faced changing weather and changing lake levels. And for reasons we still don't completely understand, they began moving stone. One piece, then another, then thousands more, until a chain of enormous formations stretched across the prehistoric shoreline. Eventually, the water rose. The landscape changed. Generations disappeared. And the structures sank beneath the lake. For more than 5,000 years, they remained there, waiting. And that brings us back to the mystery that appeared on the modern map. At first, researchers saw strange mounds beneath Lake Constance. Then they discovered they formed a pattern. Then the geology suggested they weren't natural. Then the dating pushed them back into the Neolithic. And finally, the scale revealed just how extraordinary the human effort had been. We still don't know exactly why those people built them. But perhaps that's what makes the discovery so compelling. Because the lake has preserved the evidence, while hiding the explanation. And somewhere beneath the water, the stones are still sitting exactly where prehistoric people left them. 5,000 years later, they are silent. But they are telling us something. That the world beneath the surface is often older than the world we see above it. And sometimes, the oldest mysteries aren't buried in the ground at all. They're underwater. If you enjoy stories where modern science uncovers forgotten worlds hidden in plain sight, subscribe for more.